Deborah, you're in Paris.
I am, Merve. I'm in Paris reading your brilliant annotated Mrs Dalloway, which is so exceptionally interesting and fascinating. I really wish that I could just curl up on the sofa and read nothing else for a week. The reason I'm here is because two of my books in the Living Autobiography series, Things I Don't Want to Know, and The Cost of Living, translated into French, have won the Femina Prize for a work of translated literature. And the reason I mention this is because Virginia Woolf won the Femina Prize in 1928, as far as I can gather, for To the Lighthouse.
Do you know, I read The Cost of Living curled up on a sofa in Paris myself some years back. And I felt very moved by and called by your opening with the young woman.
Yeah.
And is what's his name? Big Silver, is that right? Yes, and Big Silver, and your offering of your story to that young woman as the story she might actually need. And at that point in my life, yours was the story that I needed. So I feel very grateful to you for having written that book, and congratulations on the prize. That's wonderful.
Thank you, Merve. And I actually think that Virginia Woolf was the writer who spoke to me as a young woman. I'm quite pleased that in the way that you described, I'm quite pleased that the first Woolf that I started was actually A Room of One's Own. And the second was Mrs Dalloway, because I got a sense of a very serious, calmly furious, searing critique in action. Woolf always embodies her arguments with in her essayistic writing, with someone a bit like herself steering the voice, and she's so gentle, and she is also very fierce. And what I took away from A Room of One's Own, apart from all the usual that is well talked about, is I sort of fell in love with her because she bought a Persian cat with the very first check she got for her journalism. I thought it was so sweet. She makes the point that that she's privileged, and that she has some private money and could have paid the rent or the butcher's bills, as she put it, but she went and got herself a cat, and somehow I never forgot it. The next book was Mrs Dalloway, and you.
And well, I was thinking about what you said about how she embodies her critique, and how you never lose a sense for the people behind the ideas that she's putting into motion. Because I read Mrs. Dalloway first, but then I read the essays that were collected in the Common Reader. And those are essays that, as a critic, I come back to over and over and over again for two reasons. The first is the one that you mentioned, that the people, these long dead writers, are allowed to sing. You feel as if they're in the room with you. She reanimates them and puts them right in front of your eyes, and it feels like you could almost sort of reach out and touch their essence or touch their spirit. She's so amazing at that. But the second reason I've always really loved her as a critic as much as I love her as a novelist is because she doesn't let anybody off the hook. Mm-hmm. So she is not uncritically celebratory of anyone. And I think about her wonderful essay on George Eliot, when she writes that it's Eliot's heroines that make Eliot come across as a little bit dogmatic at times. And it's a wonderful moment of criticism in a piece that's otherwise really, really appreciative. And I think that as a critic, that's what I come back to, is that idea that a deep admiration and a love for the writers who call to us doesn't have to be completely saccharine.
Yeah.
It can be spiky at moments.
And I think necessary, actually. So when I first read Mrs. Dalloway, I know that you read it when you were really young.
Young.
Like 12, is that right?
I think I say 10 or 11.
Oh, wow.
They're entirely too young to understand it. Yeah.
Yeah, but how impressive. I think I was 18, 19. So this is a novel that we return to at different times in our lives, and I'm guessing for readers out there who return to the book that it becomes something new every time. When I was 18, 19, I wasn't interested in the character of Clarissa Dalloway at all. I couldn't see the point of her. I thought, well, there she is. She's buying flowers for her party. She's married to this Conservative MP, and I was interested in the, as I saw it then, multiple points of view, the multi-layering of time and all of that. But actually, I was much more interested in the male characters. On that first read, that was Peter Walsh and Warren Smith. They seemed to, they seemed just to sort of have a sense of purpose on that first read that I couldn't quite get from Mrs. Dalloway. And I really enjoyed her argument as a young woman with Peter Walsh, because, you know, the way he's always saying to Clarissa Dalloway, you could be more than this. Make something of yourself. Don't choose this miniature life. The Beauvoir argument, you know, have an expanded life. You could be more. You could be so much more. And Clarissa saying, well, who do you want me to be? And that was interesting. It was interesting at 18 to sort of think about young men in my life who were a bit like Peter Walsh. When I reread it, I have to say, Merve, I've reread it many times, but I reread it a year ago at 59, and oh my goodness, was I interested in Clarissa Dalloway. So I'm going to hand over to you. First of all, we start with an assassination. She is Mrs. Richard Dalloway, not even Clarissa Dalloway. I noticed that. So let's just start there.
Well, I actually think, before you hand it over to me, and I have lots to say about reading this novel at different moments in one's life. I mean, well, maybe I should just say biographically that when I read it, when I was 10 or 11, I read it with a boy. I was a very sort of nerdy, reclusive, bookish child. And at some point I found the one person who would read novels with me, because it was what I liked to do. And we forged this very close friendship, and the kind of friendship that you have with a member of the opposite sex before sexuality is something that's at the forefront of your mind. So it's always dormant, but it's unspoken. And so things can continue in a state of relative innocence. And we read this book together, and we wrote each other letters about it. And I must have written a letter at some point where I told him that I thought Clarissa Dalloway and Peter Walsh reminded me of us, which is, of course, an absurd thing for a 10-year-old little American, Turkish American immigrant child to say that she feels the sense of identification with the white conservative MP. And my friend wrote back to me this wonderful letter, which I still have and which I talk about in the book, where he says, no, we are not Clarissa and Peter. We are Lady Brett Ashley and Jake Barnes from The Sun Also Rises, which, you know, if you remember your Hemingway, Jake Barnes is an impotent American journalist, and Lady Brett Ashley is the sexually insatiable British divorcee that loves him. And so that wasn't a particularly good pairing either. But I think that there is, maybe whatever age you come to this novel, there is that desire to use the characters to understand something about the structure of your own relationships or the structure of your own feelings. And now when I come back to this novel, I think what I use the characters for is to understand something about aging, about the passage of time, and what it means that you can feel like you've lived many lives when you present to the world as a single person, and how it is that the emotions that you felt many years ago can sometimes be sparked after long periods of lying dormant. And what does that mean for who we are and what other people mean to us? And I actually think you should read that wonderful bit on page 63 when Peter and Clarissa see each other for the first time in a while.
Okay, so let's do that. And how are you? Said Peter Walsh, positively trembling, taking both her hands, kissing both her hands. She's grown older, he thought, sitting down. I shan't tell her anything about it, he thought, a sudden embarrassment coming over him, though he had kissed her hands. Putting his hand into his pocket, he took out a large pocket knife and half opened the blade. Exactly the same, thought Clarissa. The same queer look, the same checked suit, a little out of the straight his face is, a little thinner, drier perhaps, but he looks awfully well and just the same. How heavenly it is to see you again, she explained. He had his knife out. That's so like him, she thought. He had only reached town last night, he said. Would have to go down into the country at once. And how was everything? How was everybody? Richard, Elizabeth. And what's all this? He said, tilting his penknife towards her green dress. He's very well dressed, thought Clarissa, yet he always criticizes me.
Oh, there's something so heartbreaking. Or there's something, you know, as you were reading it, I felt something. I mean, I've read it probably 12 times now. And as you were reading it, something always sort of tugs at my heart with that scene. Why choose that scene of all the moments to read from the novel?
It's just so complicated. That's what Woolf does with such consummate skill. She's light on her feet, isn't she? It's so choreographed, you know. He's trembling. I love it that his hands are actually trembling when he takes her hands. And this is the love of her life, apparently, or the love of his life, apparently. Her route out of this upper middle class, suffocating life, apparently. But who is Peter Walsh? That seems to be a question that she's asking herself all through the book, even though she's known him, you know, for so long. And there he goes again. He's asking her questions with his penknife out, always very annoying to her, and actually quite annoying as a reader. Sometimes I think there's too much of Peter Walsh and his penknife. Exactly the same, she thinks. He hasn't changed. And maybe she has, actually. But that's another thing to talk about. And he's already criticizing her dress, and he's there, as we discussed later, to see her. She needs to be seen, and he is seeing her. Well, he's going to see. Yes, yeah.
Oh no, I'm just I'm struck by something that you said about the penknife being excessive. It's a prop, isn't it? And one of the things that she doesn't foreground as much is that Clarissa has had the dress in her hand that she was about to mend. And so she also has a needle in her hand. And so she has a needle and he has a penknife, and they are about to wound each other. They are about to sort of prick at each other's memories of the other person. And that is going to be painful and yearning and irritating. And like you said, it's going to conjure all of those old feelings that become sort of mingled and muddled together in that scene. And I really like your description of it as choreographed, because one of the things that I like so much about Woolf is how meticulous she is in planning every single thing that she writes. And when you look at that section that you read from on the page, the paragraphs go Peter, Clarissa, Peter, Clarissa, Peter, Clarissa. And you almost get the sense that you as the observer are watching two people have this amazingly tense exchange, and your head is just going from one to the other, one with the knife, one with the needle. And I love that for that reason.
Of course, Virginia Woolf is the great hostess, sort of behind the great hostess that is apparently Carissa Dalloway.
But can I ask a question? Yes. Sorry, can I ask? Well, you said that when you read the novel again this past year, all of a sudden you were very interested in the character of Clarissa Dalloway. So I just want to hear you talk about that. I want to hear you speak about that.
I love it. I mean, I just thought, who is she? Is she Sylvia Plath or someone? Because it seems to me that on this reading that Woolf had projected her own melancholy and perhaps death wish onto Clarissa Dalloway. So I think that there's an abundance of life in the writing that makes up Mrs. Dalloway. The sheer stamina and energy of the writing gives a kind of vitality on the page that actually is not necessarily Clarissa Dalloway. She seems to me to be pretty melancholy, and as you say, Merve, she Woolf, for a novel that's supposed not to have been plotted, this is a highly constructed, plotted stretch of writing. Woolf is one of those writers who I sort of almost can viscerally feel writing, like there she is, she's sort of taking a breath at this line, and she's looking out of the window at this line, and she's moving her feet here. I really get a sense of the writer. As a writer, I get the sense of a writer at work with Woolf in some sort of very close way. Anyway, that great line she has remind me where it is. Is it sort of towards the end of the book? The party's begun, or about to begin. She's up in her room and she says, my blackberrying days in the sun.
Fear no more the heat of the sun.
No, not the quote for, no, not that quote. It's all over for me. I have left them all blackberrying in the sun.
Oh, right. Yes. Yes.
And those,
remember it. Yeah.
And those intimations that she has been on, that, you know, Clarissa has been ill with flu and all of that. So I got much more interested in her in the second reading.
I think, well, one of the things that Woolf writes when she is drafting Mrs. Dalloway, and I should say this is the other thing that I really like about Woolf, is that she is, I mean, maybe it's an odd thing to like, but she's sort of desperately insecure about her own writing. So she writes these novels that we consider masterpieces, that are masterpieces. And when you read the diaries, she's incredibly anxious about them, and nothing sort of lives up to her standard for what it should be. But for her, the doubtful point of the novel was always the character of Clarissa Dalloway. And she writes in her diary that she found her too stiff, too glittering and tinselly, and that she needed to bring an innumerable array of other characters to her aid. And that, to me, is where some of the vitality of this book comes from, is the energy with which you feel Woolf dashing and leaping and soaring, a little bit like the plane that we see circling London, from the mind of one character to the next. And that kind of generous and completely pervasive spirit of the narrator with the writer behind her is operating throughout this novel.
And the pervasive spirit of Sally Seton. I think you should read an extract, and I know that you have chosen one.
I will read from the scene that many people call the orgasm scene. And we can talk about whether that's an appropriate designation for it or not. So this is immediately after Clarissa Dalloway has climbed up to her attic room, and she is thinking about the times that she had failed her husband, Richard. And she thinks, she could see what she lacked. It was not beauty. It was not mind. It was something central which permeated, something warm which broke up surfaces and rippled the cold contact of man and woman, or of women together. For that, she could dimly perceive. She resented it, had a scruple picked up heaven knows where, or, as she felt, sent by nature, who is invariably wise. Yet she could not resist sometimes yielding to the charm of a woman, not a girl, of a woman, confessing, as to her they often did, some scrape, some folly. And whether it was pity, or their beauty, or that she was older, or some accident, like a faint scent or a violin next door, so strange is the power of sounds at certain moments, she did undoubtedly then feel what men felt. Only for a moment, but it was enough. It was a sudden revelation, a tinge like a blush, which one tried to check, and then as it spread, one yielded to its expansion and rushed to the farthest verge, and there quivered and felt the world come closer, swollen with some astonishing significance, some pressure of rapture, which split its thin skin and gushed and poured with an extraordinary alleviation over the cracks and sores.
Beautiful.
Exclamation mark. There's an exclamation mark at the end of that.
And what do you make of that?
You know, I have quite mixed feelings about that scene, because on the one hand, it is describing that unchecked, spreading, unstoppable rush of pleasure. But on the other hand, we have those cracks and those sores and something gushing and pouring. And there are times when that sounds a little bit more like a wound or like pus to me. There's something pestilent in that vision of sexuality. And of course, this is a novel where sexuality for so many of its characters is buried, is denied. A novel where a character like Richard Dalloway can't bring himself to tell his wife that he loves her, where Clarissa has failed her husband, but remembers this moment of extraordinary sexual pleasure, which repeats with women. But it can't be acknowledged on the surface of the text in any sort of straightforward way. And so it is something wounded, something that has to be scabbed over at the same time that it's something pleasurable and beautiful.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Sally Seton, marriage is a catastrophe for women, she says. And then, by the end of the book, we see her conventional, married, lots of children.
Five children.
And all of that. I mean, it's very odd for Woolf to have created a Clarissa Dalloway, because Woolf herself and her sister Vanessa, in a way, married very well, because they married men who were going to give them total freedom to write and in Vanessa's case, to paint. They were not conventional marriages at all. There was no way that Virginia's sister, Vanessa, would have been able to have had children and get up and paint something every single day, whether it's a cupboard, a canvas, a saucer, a mug. We see this at Charleston House. To have had the other relationships that she did, sort of basically an open marriage with Clive Bell. And then Leonard Woolf, it seemed that he had, I don't know if this is entirely true, but he didn't have a damaging level of envy of her work and her success. And then we should really just sort of talk about the Hogarth Press as well. We just add this to the mix, because really, Woolf is so far away from Clarissa Dalloway. So there's the Hogarth Press, run by Virginia and Leonard. And I was amazed to discover that Freud's interpretation of dreams was published by them 50 years after it was published in Germany. I think that's right. So that's the book that Freud thought was going to end his career. He had nightmares for weeks before it was published in 1899, 1900. Hope Merle's long poem Paris, amongst others, So there's this avant-garde work being published by the Woolfs, and these extraordinary marriages the two sisters have made to be able to continue making their own art. And there is Clarissa Dalloway. So and who I sort of love. By the time I read her at 59, I actually have a tear in my eye when Peter Walsh's heart is beating yet again. First his hands, he's always trembling when he sees her. There she was, there she was. What a beautiful last line. There she was.
I mean, it's interesting how, I mean, the strongest emotions in this novel, the strongest emotions seem to circulate outside of marriage.
Yeah.
And that to me has always been very striking about the novel, that there are all of these pockets of feeling in the past, in the present, and that they are all tucked away. And I wonder about those marriages. I wonder about Virginia's and Vanessa's marriages. I wonder if we as present day readers have, I don't know, a tendency to idealize how well they worked, because they certainly worked. And one of my favorite writers, Elizabeth Hardwick, has a great observation about how no one in that crowd seemed to be able to rise to the level of jealousy. They were all sort of happy, or at least not discontent, to share. And I don't know, part of me thinks that that must be a fantasy, or in part a fantasy that we project onto them, so that somewhere in time and space we have the utopia of the happy and the free marriage.
Well, more interesting in a way is that they're making this new language. Certainly Woolf is. And she could not make that language, I happen to believe, in the structures that were available to her, to a woman of her generation, without somebody like Woolf. I'm sure that I'm sure they weren't perfect marriages, you know. And as for Vanessa, the extraordinary covers that she made for her sister's work. I mean, how incredible to have a sister design your book covers for you. You know, they were incredible sisters, Vanessa and Virginia. You know, the British weren't exactly in love with their modernists. I thought it was a silly continental experiment. And so this small group living in this way and making this work that was very European, if you like, you know, that again was another language, and there's no way that Vanessa could have made forays into the visual language she was making. I don't believe, and had been a mother of you know, and she was such a committed and loving mother, and she needed another structure to make her work. Anyway, I wanted to ask you something else about moments of being. Now, I have in my diary this quote from Woolf, and I wondered if you might be able to place it for me, because I love it so much. It sounds like Timothy Leary or something. So here's Woolf. We are the words, we are the music, we are the thing itself.
Oh, that's
who's we?
Who's we? Well, I think, you know, one of the things I really admire about Woolf is that in theory, at least, she had a very democratic sense of people's capacity to think and to feel at the highest levels of intensity possible. And so I do think for her that we truly is anyone and everyone. And one of my favorite essays of hers, which she was working on at the same time that she was working on Mrs. Dalloway, is Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Brown. And it has that wonderful moment where she's in the train car and she is observing the sort of shabby little woman sitting in the train car across from her and is creating a life of infinite complexity and emotion for this person.
Mm.
And when she says, we are the music, we are the thing itself, I think that's expressing her conviction that just about anybody that you meet has all of the richness and the variety of life bound up in themselves. They are the thing itself. They are life itself. And that's one of the things that I think differentiates Mrs. Dalloway from the novels that came before it. Because, you know, just going back to what we were talking about the Woolf's marriage, I mean, Leonard was, I think, her greatest intellectual companion, but also her first and her most ferocious critic. And when something didn't work, he told her.
Mm.
And so I love the diary entries where she is recording what she has shown Leonard and what his responses are. And when she starts writing Mrs. Dalloway, he has just finished reading Jacob's Room, and he complains that that novel doesn't have a philosophy of life. And so Mrs. Dalloway is her attempt to articulate that philosophy of life. And part of it is that anyone in this world has within them everything that life has to offer any of us.
Mm.
And I like that vision. I like that vision very, very, very much.
Exactly. I'm just going to repeat it because it's from Moments of Being. We are the words, we are the music, we are the thing itself. Mm. Yeah. And let's just talk a little bit about To the Lighthouse, which actually I think is my favorite of the novels.
Why is it your favorite? You tell me.
I wish I knew. I return to it over and over again. I find Mrs. Ramsay obviously an attempt to come to terms with her own mother, to find something good in the rituals that were available to her own mother. She is the angel in the house, you know, that Woolf had to kill to become a writer. Mrs. Ramsay has to die twice. In a way, she's the angel in the house, and we know that she dies in the book. Then the incredible way that Woolf collapses time. The whole novel should collapse with a stunt like that. But she's such a consummate writer that she actually manages to do something that I believe is almost impossible. There is actually no British writer from the past, I should say, dead British writer, that I admire more than Woolf. Because I just think that the design of her books and the impossibility, that sort of temporal experiments that she was going for really were not experiments because they were achieved. That's the thing. Lily Briscoe, I read over and over again in relation to Mrs. Ramsay, The Dreadful Husband,
I'm always moved by the little boy.
James.
Very moved by James, yes. And the kind of excessive expectations that one has of one's parents.
Yeah.
The absolute devastation when those expectations cannot be met.
Yes. So it seems that we're saying that it's the father's job to absolutely crush all expectations in boy James, or is he just a realist, Mr. Ramsay? What do you think? talking, we were talking about James wanting to get to the lighthouse, take a boat to the lighthouse, and his mother always saying, yes, perhaps tomorrow the sun will shine, the sea will be calm, the weather will be on your side. And his father saying, absolutely not, the weather's going to be treacherous tomorrow.
Right. No, it's right. I mean, one of the things that I like so much about that is that from a child's perspective, what looks like cruelty might be from the parent's perspective an attempt to inoculate the child against disappointment. And so I love how that question of, will we go to the lighthouse tomorrow or not, just captures that amazing seesawing between the perspective of the child and the perspective of the parent. And I think that's what, to me, maybe that's what's most interesting about To the Lighthouse, because it is, I think, the last of her truly autobiographical novels, whereas you say she is trying to exorcise the death of her mother and the sort of absurd theatrics of her father after her mother's death. And in it, you almost feel like she's inhabiting both the position of the child, watching in an ununderstanding way what the adults around them are doing, but also the adult who looks back on that child and that child's misunderstandings and that child's excesses of feeling. And so what you're saying about what she's doing with time, in that sense, inhabiting those two times at once, the time of the child and the time of the adult, is to me something that she does extraordinarily throughout Dalloway as well. The capacity to be your multiple selves at any particular moment. And that's one of the things that I love about To the Lighthouse, that even though it flags for us in that middle section that time is passing, time passes.
Oh, for me, it's just the jewel of the book, that passage. Let's talk a little bit about her fury, her political fury. I mean, going back to Mrs. Dalloway, war, mental health, the treatment of shell-shocked soldiers. But I mean, she's absolutely furious. That really was amplified for me. So I keep saying it's the second read because I want to do kind of 17 and 59 and 30 and 40, you know. But I mean, that really was amplified in this read. And also the sort of incredible way that she can, in one sentence, juxtapose the arrangement of sweet peas and the trauma of shell shock.
Did you feel like reading her after the last 18, 19 months? So reading her after or during lockdown, reading her after the kind of catastrophic mismanagement of the pandemic by the British government, but also by the American government. Well, I equally blame our two countries. Yeah. Did you feel like that changed?
I did actually reread A Room of One's Own. And Sylvia Whitman of Shakespeare and Company told me something very interesting. Apparently, for the first time in that store, Hemingway was knocked off the #1 on the bestseller list and replaced by Woolf. So that there were more readers so presumably A Movable Feast was replaced in the pandemic by, you know, A Room of One's Own. I actually played around a little bit with the start of A Room of One's Own at the end of the third living autobiography, Real Estate. So we all know that Woolf, or the narrator, or someone quite like Woolf, is told by a porter at a Cambridge. I was going to say, it's a Oxbridge College, but anyway, to get off the grass. She's walking on the grass. Her place is on the gravel. The turf is for scholars and all the rest of it. She's furious because she didn't even have an education. Her brothers were educated, but she and Vanessa were sort of educated at home and made use of their father's library. And so I end Real Estate with, I don't want to give a spoiler, but sort of with permission, walk on the grass, as it were. Sorry to be so oblique. And you were reading.
No, I've read it, so you wouldn't spoil it for me, but I don't want to spoil it for our listeners who should read it. I mean, you should read the whole trilogy because it's wonderful. But I think, well, two things. To go back to what you said about her political fury.
Yeah.
I mean, it's amazing to me that people do not realize that Woolf is a political novelist, and that Mrs. Dalloway in particular, but also A Room of One's Own, Three Guineas, they are these very, very, very biting satires of the ruling class and of its ways of being. And there's a wonderful critic, late critic named Alex Wordling, who writes a fantastic piece called Mrs. Dalloway and the Social System. And in it, he shows how all of the members of the ruling class that are in the novel are described as being embalmed in some way. They have wax poured into their ears and across their hearts, and they are insensible to the pain and to the feeling of others. There's a real kind of commitment to a stoicism and a contempt for deep emotion. Mm-hmm. And so, it was just sort of amazing reading this as we were all being told that that we were going to go back to normal, that we were not going to grieve the mass death that we've all experienced for the past 18 months, and that nobody was going to be held accountable for it in any way. And so there is something about the political critique, the satire that she's offering in the novel that I think really resonates with our present moment. And the idea that we just go on with our lives and sort of harden our hearts, embalm ourselves to what has transpired over the past several months. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't surprise me that she knocked Hemingway off of the bestsellers list at Shakespeare and Company, because she is a novelist for the moment. I mean, a question I have for you, Deborah, is other than yourself, because I do hear Woolf etched through your writing, who are the other novelists today whom you believe to be carrying her torch, or who do you think is writing themselves into her legacy?
I think there is something of Woolf in Claire Louise Bennett.
I love Pond.
In a way, I'm thinking of Pond. Yeah. I mean, there's also a lot of Beckett in Claire Louise's work. I wonder if carrying the torch is the right term. What do we actually mean? I think what it is that she embodies ideas in a way that it's very hard to do that, and that is and that's sort of my game too, because you don't want to walk lots of theory. I don't want to walk lots of theory through my books. I don't need readers to know that I read lots of clever books. I want my books to be cleverer than I am, actually. And I sort of feel an affinity with Woolf there, who sort of made her way through her father's library, and like myself, learned, I don't know, she learned Greek at the age of 8 and all of that. But she was on side. This was the thing. She deeply understood she was very practical. She deeply understood that her job was not to flatter the gentlemen of her generation, although she herself did love to be flattered, but you know, good. I hope she was. She was practical. What you need to write is some space and some money. That remains a very helpful note. And then lashings of skill, that helps too. So I don't know who else really. Maybe some of Rachel Cusk. I don't know. I think. Yeah. I don't know.
Well, I love in the cost of living, but also in real estate, those descriptions of just setting up rooms, of setting up the spaces in which one writes. And there's something to your sensibility that's also, on the one hand, practical, and on the other hand, beautiful. And I think it's that balance that makes your novels feel so evocative, that you set up these rooms that your reader actually wants to walk into with you, wants to inhabit with you. And hearing you speak about a room of one's own alongside your work suddenly makes that clear to me in a way that it wasn't before. I mean, I might add to that list someone like Valeria Luiselli.
Ah, good. Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So the Lost Children Archive, for people who haven't read it, tells the story of this bourgeois family from New York whose marriage is dissolving, and they have 2 children, and they're going on this road trip down to the US-Mexico border. And at the same time, these 2 young children are crossing the border and are lost in the desert. And Luiselli has an amazing stretch toward the end of the novel where she uses that Woolfian technique of putting something up in the air, an eagle, I believe, or some sort of bird, maybe a hawk. And she uses it to triangulate between the perspectives of the 2 children from the bourgeois family who are lost in the desert and 2 children who have crossed the Mexican border and are seeking to be reunited with their mother and are lost in the desert. And that is a very sort of direct borrowing from Woolf, and one that is also thinking about what kind of political purposes we can put modernism toward. And so I really, really love how thoughtful she is about taking up at least a very sort of Woolfian technique in doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well,
shall we?
I think
Shall we conclude our Dalloway Day conversation?
Can I say that every time I read this book, it becomes a new book. It's renewed in some way. I think I understand it. I think I know most of its characters well. I think I know most of its strategies well. But actually, when I read it again, I find new ones. And if you'll forgive me, I'm just going to read the end. I will come, said Peter, but he sat on for a moment. What is this terror? What is this ecstasy? He thought to himself. What is it that fills me with extraordinary excitement? It is Clarissa, he said, for there she was.
Thank you for that beautiful reading.